Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the most delightfully ridiculous arenas in human history, the world of Georgian courtship. That's right, we're talking about love, lust, and the long, painful road to matrimony in the land of powdered wigs, suspiciously tight corsets, and flirtation so encoded it practically required a decoder ring. Forget Bridgerton. Forget the soft-focus ballrooms with perfect lipstick and whispered sweet nothings. Real Georgian courtship was a bizarre ritual involving sweat-stained gloves, aggressively bad poetry, chaperones with the energy of parole officers, and marriages arranged over livestock negotiations. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a huge, heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. Your messages really do shape what ends up on this channel, and it means more than you know. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Also, just a quiet little mention. The channel is now live on Spotify too, so if you'd rather drift off to this there, the link is in the description. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what dating was actually like when you weren't allowed to be alone in a room with the person you were marrying? When a glimpse of an ankle was basically softcore content? When writing someone a letter was the emotional equivalent of showing up on their doorstep holding a boom box? How did anyone get engaged when everyone smelled like wet wool and rosewater gone off? Could you survive a courtship where your mother negotiated your future husband's yearly income before she let him sit next to you at dinner? What if you hated dancing? What if your teeth fell out before your wedding day? What if your fiancé turned out to be, plot twist, your cousin? Could you endure an entire season of eligible bachelors circling your family fortune like ducks around a breadcrumb? Would you survive the scandal of gasp, laughing too loudly in public? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in 1780. You're wearing something that weighs more than you do, your hair has its own weather system, and somewhere downstairs your father is sizing up a man with bad breath and £3,000 a year. Good luck. Let's start with the big, uncomfortable truth about Georgian courtship. It wasn't really about love. It was about contracts, acres, dowries, and who your grandmother's third cousin happened to be. The second you turned what we today consider a deeply awkward teenager, you were no longer a child. You were inventory. Your family didn't look at you and see a young person with hopes and dreams. They saw a small but potentially useful negotiating chip wrapped in silk. Welcome to the marriage market, where the goods are human, the pricing is opaque, and returns are absolutely not accepted. For young women, the timeline was brutal. By around 16 or 17, you were expected to be ready for display. By your early 20s, if you hadn't secured a husband, whispered concerns began to circulate at tea parties. By your mid-20s, you were officially considered, in the grim vocabulary of the day, on the shelf. By 30, unmarried and without prospects, you had essentially been filed away into the permanent collection, where you would remain for the rest of your life as someone's unmarried aunt, tolerated, pitied, and eventually used as a live-in governess for other people's children. It's like aging out of a dating app, except the dating app is your entire society, and the algorithm is your own mother. For men, the pressure was real, but differently shaped. A man could wait longer, much longer, and often did. Many gentlemen didn't marry until their 30s or even 40s, once they had inherited their estates, advanced in their professions, or simply gotten around to it. Men had the luxury of time, women did not. This fundamental asymmetry shaped every single interaction that followed. A woman at 19 was on her prime marketing season. A man at 35 was just getting started. The entire system ran on information, and the information was not subtle. Everyone knew exactly how much land your father owned, how many sisters you had to split the family money with, whether your grandfather had died wealthy or merely well-connected, and whether there was any madness in your family line. Mothers maintained mental spreadsheets of eligible bachelors that would put modern recruiters to shame. Fathers discussed settlements over port after dinner. Young people were paraded at parties the way prize ponies were walked at county fairs, and with roughly the same level of input into their own futures. Even your body was part of the inventory. Good teeth were a selling point, because by your 30s most people had lost several. A clear complexion was prized because smallpox scars were everywhere. A decent singing voice could tip the scales. An ability to sit still for 3 hours while being stared at by strangers was essentially a requirement. You weren't expected to be fascinating. You were expected to be presentable, polite, and vaguely musical. And here's the kicker. Everyone knew this was the system, and everyone pretended it wasn't. The fiction of romance was maintained at all costs. Poems were written, flowers were exchanged, glances were stolen. But behind every dewy-eyed declaration was a lawyer with a quill, calculating jointures. It's a bit like modern dating if every date ended with your prospective partner's accountant joining you for dessert to discuss your 401,000. The Georgians just dispensed with the pretense of separate steps and did it all at once. So as you stand there, corseted into breathlessness, smiling at strangers in a room that smells vaguely of sweat and lavender, remember, you're not a person tonight. You are a portfolio, and someone is about to make an offer. Every spring, the wealthier families of England packed up their enormous trunks, their enormous wigs, and their enormous expectations, and descended on London for what was known as the season. Think of it as an extremely well-dressed Hunger Games, except instead of weapons, everyone had fans, and instead of dying, you just got engaged. The season ran roughly from late winter to early summer, and was a non-stop carousel of balls, dinners, operas, and garden parties, all designed to ensure that young people of appropriate class could meet, assess, and ideally agree to legally bind themselves to each other for life. The logistics alone were staggering. Moving an entire aristocratic family from the country to a rented London townhouse was not like packing for a weekend trip. It involved dozens of trunks, multiple carriages, servants travelling ahead, servants travelling behind, and an incredible amount of luggage containing outfits you would need exactly once. An unmarried daughter might require 15 evening gowns, 12 morning dresses, riding habits, walking costumes, opera cloaks, and shoes for each of them, because the idea of repeating an outfit at a significant event was considered faintly tragic. The calendar was punishing. A typical week during the season might include 3 or 4 balls running until 2 in the morning, a private concert, an afternoon of calling on acquaintances, a trip to the opera, a dinner party, a morning ride in Hyde Park, and a levee. Sleep was optional. Napping in the afternoon was standard and entirely necessary, because if you passed out at a ball, you were done. Picture running a marathon every day while wearing a wedding cake. Now do it for 4 months straight. The geography of the season was also highly specific. You had to be seen in the right places at the right times. Hyde Park in the afternoon was for walking or driving, where you could casually encounter other families and exchange carefully calibrated greetings. Almac's assembly rooms on a Wednesday night was the social pinnacle, and getting in required vouchers from a committee of terrifying patronesses who could reject you for wearing the wrong trousers. Yes, trousers instead of breeches once got a future Prime Minister turned away at the door. That's the level of petty we're dealing with. The financial toll was extraordinary. A season could easily consume a significant portion of a family's annual income between the townhouse rental, the clothing, the carriage upkeep, the servants' wages, the entertaining expenses, and the endless small costs of simply existing in fashionable London. Families routinely went into debt to fund their daughters' seasons, gambling that the investment would pay off in the form of an advantageous marriage. Some won that bet, many didn't, and the social calculations were relentless. Who to invite, who to snub, who was rising in influence, who was falling, which hostess was the one whose invitation actually mattered, which family had money but no breeding, which had breeding but no money, and what that meant for seating arrangements. It was like trying to play three-dimensional chess while also remembering everyone's middle name and favourite type of cake. The whole thing resembled modern networking conferences, except with more lace, fewer lanyards, and significantly higher stakes. At a networking conference, the worst outcome is an awkward elevator pitch. At the season, the worst outcome is spending the rest of your life married to someone who smells faintly of old beef. The pressure was immense, the glamour was real, and somewhere beneath all the candles and compliments, thousands of young people were trying desperately to figure out whose hand they'd be holding for the next 40 years. Before you could do any actual flirting, you first had to be officially released into society, which was a whole event. Young women were presented at court, sometimes literally to the Queen, in ceremonies so elaborate and expensive they made a modern wedding look like a potluck. Your first appearance as an eligible young lady was supposed to signal to the world that you were, technically speaking, available. It was also supposed to demonstrate that you could walk backward in a £15 dress without tripping. Many could not. The presentation itself was a feat of engineering and endurance. Debutantes wore enormous hoop skirts that made doorways a mathematical problem, court trains that stretched 3 yards behind them, and a mandatory headdress of ostrich plumes that added another foot or two to their already precarious height. Imagine walking in a cathedral-sized tent attached to a peacock-shaped hat while balancing a small bouquet and suppressing the urge to cry. Now imagine doing all of this in front of the actual Queen of England, who is watching you with the faint disinterest of someone who has watched hundreds of teenagers do this before and is internally calculating when she can leave. The tricky part was the exit. You were not, under any circumstances, permitted to turn your back on the monarch. That meant backing out of the royal presence while dragging the enormous train behind you, navigating around other terrified debutantes, and maintaining the illusion of graceful composure. Trains had to be kicked out behind you as you walked, which required a very specific trick of the ankle that required months of practice. Girls practiced this manoeuvre for weeks in their bedrooms, with towels tied to their waists, while their mothers watched like Olympic coaches reviewing gymnastics routines. The expense was eye-watering. A presentation dress could cost the equivalent of a small house. The plumes were imported. The fabric was specific. The shoes would never be worn again. Families sometimes went into serious debt for this one single afternoon. It was considered an investment, much the way parents today might invest in orthodontics or college applications, except with significantly more ostriches involved. After the court presentation, the newly launched debutante entered what was essentially a public auditioning phase. Her name was now known. She could attend balls. She could be introduced to gentlemen. Her dance card could be filled. Her social capital was officially lave. Everything she did from this moment forward was observed, catalogued and discussed. Eat too enthusiastically at dinner? Noted. Laugh too loudly at a joke? Noted. Dance twice with the same gentleman? Very noted, and possibly reported to your mother before you'd finished the dance. The emotional toll of all this was rarely discussed. You were 17, possibly 18, often lacking any meaningful life experience beyond embroidery and light French, and you were suddenly expected to perform social perfection in front of the most critical audience in Europe. Many young women remembered their first season with a mixture of fondness and residual anxiety, the way modern people remember their wedding day or a particularly bad job interview that somehow went on for 6 months. and if your coming out went badly, if you stumbled, if your plumes caught on a chandelier, if you accidentally laughed at the king, the damage could linger. Gossip about a disastrous debut could follow a young woman for seasons afterward. Some families deliberately presented younger daughters first to test the process. Others rushed their eldest out the door and hoped for the best. Either way, there was no practice round. You got one shot and then you were in the game, whether you felt ready or not. Let's talk about what you had to wear for all of this. For women, imagine being laced into a corset tight enough to rearrange your internal organs, then strapped into panniers, which were basically wire cages on your hips designed to make you 5 feet wide. Add 3 petticoats, a stomacher, stockings held up by ribbon, and shoes that weren't designed for walking so much as for teetering decoratively. For men, it wasn't much better. Silk breeches that squeaked, stockings that sagged, a waistcoat, a coat, a cravat tied so elaborately it took an hour, and buckled shoes. Everyone was deeply uncomfortable. Everyone pretended they weren't. This was considered romantic. The corset, known then as stays, was the foundation of the entire operation. Stays were constructed from stiff linen reinforced with strips of whalebone or sometimes actual wood, and they were laced up the back by a servant, because it was physically impossible to do it yourself. The goal was to produce the fashionable silhouette of the moment, which generally involved a flat chest, a conical torso, and the kind of posture usually associated with Victorian table legs. Breathing deeply was optional. Bending over was impossible. Picking something up off the floor required either a very obliging companion or the willingness to simply abandon the object forever. Panniers were the truly baroque element. These were cage-like structures worn under skirts to extend the hips outward, sometimes to an absolutely absurd width. At the height of fashion, a court dress with full panniers could be 5 or 6 feet across at the hips. This meant doorways had to be navigated sideways. Sitting down required significant planning. 2 women wearing full panniers could not comfortably stand next to each other in any normal-sized room. At court, the ladies simply accepted that they were going to collide with everything. It's like wearing a dining room table strapped to your waist and being expected to look delicate. The makeup situation was its own special horror. Fashionable pale skin was achieved with white lead paste, which, fun fact, was poisonous and slowly destroyed your face, prompting you to apply more of it to cover the damage in a kind of cosmetic doom spiral. Rouge was applied to the cheeks in bright circles. Beauty patches, small pieces of black fabric cut into shapes, were stuck to the face to cover pimples or smallpox scars. Hair was powdered grey or white using flour or starch, which attracted mice. This is not a metaphor. Women reportedly found mice in their hair, occasionally living ones. Men's fashion had its own baroque suffering. A gentleman's cravat, the elaborate neckcloth tied in complicated knots, could take over an hour to tie correctly, and ruining it meant starting over with a fresh one. Some dedicated dandies reportedly went through dozens of cravats a morning, their valets gathering up the rejected ones in silent, long-suffering piles. Silk stockings showed every wrinkle, sagged at the knee, and had a tendency to ladder at embarrassing moments. Breeches were cut so tight that sitting down was a cautious negotiation between man and fabric. And the shoes. Oh, the shoes. Heels were worn by both sexes because apparently 2 inches of instability was not enough. Shoes were often made for specific occasions, not for walking, and definitely not for comfort. The streets of London were covered in mud, horse dung, and much worse. Crossing a street in silk shoes was a small tragedy every time. Pattens, wooden overshoes were sometimes worn to elevate you above the filth, which worked about as well as it sounds. All of this, all of it, was considered the visible proof that you were marriage material. The pain was the point. Suffer beautifully, or go home. You couldn't just walk up to someone you found attractive and start talking to them. That would be scandalous. Instead, you needed to be formally introduced by a mutual acquaintance, and that acquaintance had to be socially appropriate. Your blacksmith could not introduce you to a duke. Your dog walker, assuming you had one, definitely could not. The introduction was the gateway. Without it, you did not exist to the other person, no matter how many longing stares you exchanged across a crowded assembly room. You were, for all social purposes, a ghost in a silk gown. The hierarchy of who could introduce whom was labyrinthine. A person of lower social standing could not presume to introduce someone above them. A lady needed to consent to being introduced to a gentleman, meaning her chaperone or hostess would typically ask her in advance, in hushed tones, whether she was willing to make the acquaintance. If she said no, the introduction simply did not happen. The gentleman in question might be waiting across the room, prepared, smiling hopefully, only to have the matchmaker drift back and quietly mention that Miss So-and-so had a headache. The headache was real. The headache was also strategic. The introduction itself followed a script so rigid it could have been etched in stone. Names were exchanged in a specific order. Titles were invoked correctly. Gentlemen bowed. Ladies curtsied. Certain compliments were considered acceptable. Others were considered forward. Once an introduction had been made, the two parties could, theoretically, speak to each other at future social events without needing to be reintroduced, but only in public settings. Private conversation still required further social permission, preferably involving a chaperone, a piano, or both. And here's the part that makes it properly absurd. Even after being introduced, you still could not necessarily approach the person you were interested in. You needed a socially acceptable reason. Asking her to dance was acceptable. Commenting on the weather was acceptable. Walking directly up to her and telling her she had captivating eyes was absolutely not acceptable. Would be reported to her father by nightfall, and would likely end any future possibility of communication whatsoever. Think of it as the original sliding into the DMs, except the DMs are locked behind a gatekeeping system run by your friend's aunt. The whole system created an arena of intense non-verbal communication. Because direct approach was forbidden, enormous weight was placed on glances, smiles, and strategic positioning. A young woman who wished to signal interest in a particular gentleman might, purely by coincidence of course, find herself standing near him at the refreshments table, or just happen to be sitting in the path of his promenade around the ballroom. Plausible deniability was everything. If confronted, you could always claim you simply hadn't noticed he was there, while your cheeks betrayed you in colour. Servants played a quiet but enormous role in the introduction economy. A well-placed footman could ensure that a letter was delivered to the correct drawing room at the correct moment. A lady's maid could slip a note to a gentleman's valet, who could slip it to the gentleman himself. Entire flirtations could be conducted through domestic staff, with the principal parties never quite acknowledging in public that anything was happening at all. The servants, of course, knew everything, they always did. And woe to the gentleman who attempted to skip the introduction stage entirely. Approaching a young lady uninvited, uncleared and unsponsored was social suicide. You'd be branded a pest, or worse, a rake. Your name would circulate in the worst possible way. You'd be removed from guest lists. You might as well pack up your waistcoats and move to France. The gate was real, the gate was guarded, and the key holders were watching. Once an introduction had been made, the next step, assuming interest, was the written letter. And oh, the letters. Georgian courtship generated a truly staggering quantity of correspondence, much of it astonishingly purple in its prose. Men wrote sonnets comparing women's eyes to stars, to pools, to gemstones, to all three at once if they were feeling ambitious. Women wrote back in carefully measured tones, because if you sounded too eager, you looked cheap, and if you sounded too distant, he'd wander off to the next heiress. Writing a letter in the 1700s was basically writing a text message, except it took 3 days to send and might get read aloud by your father at breakfast. The physical act of writing a letter was already a production. You needed decent paper, which was expensive. You needed quills, which had to be sharpened. You needed ink, which had to be mixed. You needed sealing wax, a seal, a candle to melt the wax, and the patience not to drip wax onto the letter itself, which, if you did, ruined it. Ink spatters were common. Corrections were difficult. A letter with an ugly blot on it suggested you were either careless or insincere, neither of which was flattering, and your penmanship mattered deeply. A woman's handwriting was considered a reflection of her character, her education, and her emotional state. A controlled, elegant hand suggested refinement. A sloppy, hurried hand suggested a disordered mind. Young women were drilled in handwriting for years, copying out pages of elegant script in the hope that their eventual correspondence with a suitor would look pleasing to his eyes. It was like obsessing over the font in a job application, except you couldn't just change it. You had to physically train your fingers for a decade. Content-wise, letters walked a tightrope. You couldn't be too forward, because it would damage your reputation if the letter was ever seen by anyone else, which frankly, it almost certainly would be. Letters were regularly shared among family members, read aloud for entertainment, passed around to friends, and occasionally published decades later in memoirs. Anything you put on paper had to assume an audience of strangers in addition to its intended reader. So you wrote in a kind of code, carefully worded compliments, strategic literary references, the occasional pressed flower tucked inside, which was the Georgian equivalent of sending a winking emoji. Men had considerably more freedom. A gentleman's love letter could be elaborate, flowery, even borderline inappropriate because the social consequences for him were mild. For a woman to respond in kind was risky. Clever women learned to mirror just enough warmth to keep the suitor interested, while maintaining the plausible modesty that preserved their reputation. It was an exhausting performance, conducted entirely in ink with no backspace key. The delivery system added yet another layer of anxiety. Letters were carried by servants, by friends, sometimes by the mail, which was expensive and slow. There was always the chance a letter would be intercepted, read, lost, or delivered to the wrong house. Entire relationships could collapse because a letter went astray, and the intended recipient thought they had been ghosted. And yes, Georgian ghosting was a thing. It just took several months to become apparent. Love letters that survive from the period reveal something touching. Real people, in real emotional peril, trying to sound composed. Young men confessed to losing sleep. Young women hinted at affection while pretending they were merely being polite. Between the formal phrases and the theatrical flourishes, you can occasionally catch a glimpse of genuine, clumsy feeling. A teenager somewhere in 1782, scratching out a word for the 4th time, trying to find the right way to say something that humans have always struggled to say. Now let's introduce a character who has been lurking in the background of every single interaction so far, the chaperone. Usually an aunt, a mother, a long-suffering older married sister, or some other woman in her middle years who had been assigned the thankless task of making sure nothing fun happened. A chaperone's job was to sit in the corner of the room doing needlework, while 2 young people attempted to conduct an entire emotional relationship through strategic glances. She was there to make sure no hands touched, no knees bumped, and absolutely no one suggested going for a walk without company. The chaperone was not paid, not officially. She was simply expected. Unmarried women of a certain age were considered socially obligated to accompany younger unmarried women at every possible public event. This was theoretically a way of protecting the younger woman's reputation, but in practice it also functioned as a career for widows spinsters, and impoverished female relatives who received room, board, and the implicit status of being useful in exchange for eternally hovering near someone else's social life. It was a bit like being an emotional bodyguard, except you weren't allowed to actually defend anyone, just glare pointedly. The unwritten rules of chaperonage were exacting. A chaperone had to be present, but not intrusive. She had to be within sight and hearing, but not actively eavesdropping. She had to allow conversation but prevent intimacy. She had to notice everything but remember only what was flattering to everyone involved. Ever tried to hold a deep, meaningful conversation while your mum sits 3 feet away pretending to read? Now add 18th century acoustics, candlelight, and your entire future hinging on whether you can convey sincere affection without saying anything an older woman might clutch her pearls about. It was performance art conducted at whisper volume. Good chaperones were silently valued. A lenient aunt who quietly fell asleep in her chair was worth her weight in gold. A strict mother who sat bolt upright with a disapproving expression could absolutely ruin a promising afternoon. Young people traded information about which relatives would look the other way at a small squeeze of the hand and which would report the incident to the entire family before supper. Getting the wrong chaperone was like getting the wrong substitute teacher. Some were permissive, some were nightmares. There were, of course, ways to evade chaperonage, and young people of every era have been creative about this. Garden walks offered the possibility of temporarily being out of eyesight behind a convenient hedge. Picnics created opportunities to wander toward the edge of the group. Dancing, with its complex patterns, put the couple briefly out of the chaperone's direct observation. The music was loud, the candles flickered, the room was packed, and for a few precious moments you could exchange words nobody else could hear. These moments were treasured. People remembered them decades later. The psychological impact of constant surveillance should not be underestimated. Young women were accompanied, observed, and reported on from roughly 16 until marriage, which could be years. They had almost no truly private moments with anyone outside their immediate family. Even their bedrooms were often shared with sisters or attended by maids. The idea of being alone in a room with a man you fancy was not merely forbidden, it was genuinely unimaginable to many Georgian women, because they had never experienced solitude at all, with anyone. And yet, through all of it, couples managed to fall in love. They did it in fragments, in half-finished sentences, in notes slipped under teacups, in shared glances across rooms full of observers. Georgian courtship was, in many ways, the art of communicating everything while saying almost nothing. The chaperone might have been the enemy of romance, but she was also, quite by accident, the mother of subtlety. Every great love letter of the era exists because two people were never allowed to speak plainly. Women had developed an entire secret language using their fans, because actually speaking to the man you were interested in was often impossible. Holding the fan in front of your face meant one thing. Snapping it shut meant another. Resting it on your cheek meant I love you. Dropping it meant we will be friends, which was Georgian for I am politely rejecting you, please stop. The whole system was wildly inconsistent, varied by region, and caused regular and hilarious misunderstandings, because apparently flirtation needed to be encoded like wartime espionage. The fan itself was already a glorious object. A proper lady's fan could be made of silk, lace, paper, or painted vellum, stretched over sticks of ivory, mother of pearl, or sandalwood. Some were small and discreet. Others were enormous, spanning nearly a full arm's length when opened. They were expensive, they were beautiful, and they were functional, providing cooling in overheated ballrooms where the combination of candles, bodies, and layered clothing turned the atmosphere into something resembling a low simmer. A fan was a woman's weather system, her deflection shield, and her sign language translator all at once. The language of the fan was never codified in any official document. It drifted between etiquette manuals, gossip columns, and the oral tradition of older sisters teaching younger ones. Some meanings were widely understood. Twirling the fan in the right hand signalled that you were being watched, while twirling it in the left hand signalled that you wished you weren't. Resting the fan near your heart apparently meant deep devotion. Closing the fan slowly and deliberately meant you were willing to consider a marriage proposal. Fanning yourself quickly meant you were engaged. Fanning slowly meant you were married. Fanning wildly meant you were about to faint, which, to be fair, was often accurate. The wild card was that the vocabulary was not universal. A gesture that meant come closer in Bath might mean leave me alone in Bristol. Families passed down their own private fan dialects. Two young women from different counties might exchange entirely incompatible signals at the same ball, each believing they were communicating clearly, each wondering why the other one seemed so aloof or so aggressive. It was the 18th century equivalent of regional slang colliding. Imagine flirting in semaphore when nobody has agreed on the semaphore. The fan also provided the critical function of plausible deniability. A woman could hide her entire face behind one if she needed a moment to compose herself, laugh discreetly, or cry without being seen. She could peer over the top to lock eyes with someone across the room, then snap it shut and turn away, leaving him to wonder whether anything had just happened. Entire microdramas played out from behind the fan, unreadable to outsiders but vibrating with meaning to the participants. Ever tried to have a serious emotional conversation through a pair of sunglasses? Same energy. Men had no equivalent. There was no language of the pocket watch, no secret code involving snuff boxes, though some dandies certainly treated their snuff boxes like accessories. Gentlemen were expected to read the fan, to interpret it, to act accordingly. Failing to read a fan signal correctly could mark a man as hopelessly dense. Reading it too well could mark him as suspiciously experienced. There was no winning, only slightly less losing. And yet, despite all the confusion, despite the mismatched dialect and the dropped signals, the fan genuinely did carry emotional weight. A woman touching her fan to her lips meant something. A man watching her do it felt it. The whole thing operated at the edge of language, in a space where words were forbidden, but glances were not. And in that narrow territory, a folded piece of silk on ivory sticks became one of the most expressive objects in British social history. It was absurd, impractical, and completely understood by everyone present. The ball was the central courting arena. Balls were long, hot, and physically exhausting. The dances themselves were not the gentle twirling you've seen in costume dramas. They were complex, multi-part sequences that required memorization, stamina, and the ability to not sweat visibly into silk. A dance typically lasted half an hour. That's right. Half an hour of maintaining eye contact with someone while performing a choreographed routine in a room lit by hundreds of candles, with no deodorant in the entire building. Love bloomed under conditions that would today qualify as a sauna. The candles alone were a problem. A grand ballroom might be lit by several hundred beeswax tapers, each one throwing off heat, smoke, and the occasional drip of molten wax onto whatever lay beneath it. By midnight, the air was thick with the smell of burning wax, perfume, and damp wool. Windows were usually kept closed to prevent drafts from disturbing the musicians, which meant the room simply got hotter and hotter as the night progressed. People fainted, not for poetic reasons. They fainted because they were being slowly cooked in their own clothes. The dances themselves were a marvel of structured chaos. The minuet, the gavotte, the cotillion, and eventually the riotous scandal of the waltz, each demanded specific footwork, specific formations, and the ability to remember which partner you were supposed to be facing at any given bar of music. You learned these dances from a dancing master, who came to your house and drilled you for weeks until your feet bled and you hated him personally. By the time you arrived at the ball, you had either mastered the steps or you developed a convincing bout of gout. Both were respectable options. Pairing off was its own drama. A gentleman would approach a lady, bow, and request the honour of her hand for the next dance. She could accept or she could demur, usually claiming fatigue or a previously promised partner. Refusing a specific man without a good reason was an insult. Accepting a man meant you also had to refuse everyone else who asked you for that same dance, which created small social explosions throughout the evening as rival suitors absorbed the news. Dance rejection letters were not yet a thing, but the facial expressions accomplished the same thing in real time. And once you were dancing, physical contact was a revelation. In an era when you couldn't touch someone's arm in conversation without a scandal, a dance allowed you to place your hand in another person's hand, briefly, through gloves, while surrounded by hundreds of people and accompanied by a 14-piece orchestra. And yet, for many couples, this was the most intimate physical contact they had ever experienced with someone outside their family. The touch of a palm through kid leather could apparently produce feelings. Many diaries confirm this. Many diaries then go on to describe those feelings for several pages. The waltz, when it finally arrived in England in the early 19th century, caused a full-blown moral panic, because it required the man to place his hand on the woman's actual waist. Her physical waist. Clergymen denounced it. Newspapers warned of moral collapse. Mothers forbade their daughters. And of course everybody did it anyway, because after a lifetime of being forbidden to touch, a waltz felt like being set on fire in the best possible way. By the end of the ball, your feet ached, your clothes were soaked through, your hair had collapsed, your makeup had run, and you had fallen slightly in love with at least one person. You would go home in your carriage at 3 a.m, take off your shoes with a groan usually reserved for field labourers, and lie in bed replaying the evening in obsessive detail. Tomorrow there would be another one. You would do it all again, and you would like it. Each young lady carried a small card, often tied to her wrist, on which men wrote their names to reserve a dance. Filling your card meant you were popular. Having an empty card meant the ball was going to be a very long evening. Strategically, women learned to keep certain slots open for later, more desirable arrivals, while men studied the room like chess masters, trying to book a dance with the heiress before someone else got to her first. It was a social algorithm powered by pencil and paranoia. The card itself was usually a small, elegant object, sometimes made of ivory, sometimes of decorated cardstock, sometimes folded into a tiny booklet with its own miniature pencil attached by a silk ribbon. Some dance cards were kept as souvenirs afterward, tucked into diaries as evidence of a triumphant evening. Others were burned or discarded, evidence of evenings best forgotten. A blank card at the end of the night was not merely disappointing, it was a public document of your social failure, and it would be remembered by anyone who had seen it. The strategy behind the card was intricate. A young woman did not simply accept the first partners who asked, she planned. If a particularly desirable gentleman was known to arrive later in the evening, she might hold a dance open for him, claiming to be resting or in need of refreshment when less desirable men approached. This was risky, because if the desired man didn't arrive, or arrived and asked someone else, she would be left holding an empty slot and an excuse that no longer held water. Timing was everything. Patience was a gamble. Men had their own calculations. A man who wanted to court a specific woman had to reach her early in the evening before her card filled up, but not so early that he seemed desperate. He had to secure a dance, but ideally one of the better ones, not the opening set, which could be considered merely polite and not one of the final dances when fatigue had set in and the musicians were losing enthusiasm. The middle dances were the emotional sweet spot, where a well-executed set could actually communicate interest. It was like trying to schedule a first date and a second date simultaneously, using only a tiny piece of paper and a quill. Dance cards also created their own category of social disaster. A gentleman who wrote himself onto a lady's card and then failed to appear for the dance left her standing embarrassed on the floor when the music began. This was considered one of the worst offences a man could commit at a ball, and it was remembered. A man who stood up a dance partner might find himself unable to secure another card all night, and possibly for several events afterward, as word spread with the speed of a well-fanned flame. 2 dances with the same man in one evening was a significant statement. 3 was practically a declaration. A lady who allowed the same gentleman to write his name on her card multiple times was telling the entire room that she favoured him, and his intentions had better be serious, because her name was now publicly attached to his. Mothers watched the cards being filled out from across the room with the intensity of stockbrokers watching a ticker tape. Every name, every sequence, every slot meant something. The dance card was, in its odd small way, the earliest form of structured romantic scheduling. It predated calendars synchronized between 2 phones. It predated scheduling a coffee 3 weeks out because everyone is too busy. It was a compact, tangible record of who had chosen whom, who had been chosen in return, and whose pencils had hovered over which slots. A woman who went home with a completely full card went home triumphant, clutching a souvenir of her social victory. A woman who went home with an empty card went home quieter, tucking it into a drawer and hoping next week would be different. Once mutual interest had been established, the next logical step was the country house visit, which was essentially a week-long slumber party with legal consequences. A promising young man would be invited to stay at a family's country estate for several days, where he would be subjected to everything from formal dinners to long walks in the garden to awkward parlour games involving blindfolds and light public humiliation. This was the period during which both families observed the potential match in their natural habitat, like polite zoologists. The invitation itself was a coded proposal of intent. A family did not invite a random bachelor to stay at their estate for a week. Invitations were extended only to men the family considered, at minimum, plausible. Accepting such an invitation was itself a signal. Showing up meant you were serious enough about the young lady to submit yourself to days of observation by her entire extended family, including the grandmother with opinions, the uncle with the port habit, and the small cousins who would report every word you said directly back to the adults. The logistics of the visit were deceptively relaxed. On the surface, it looked like leisure. Morning rides, afternoon walks, evening dinners, perhaps a bit of shooting, a picnic, some music. Beneath the surface, it was an unrelenting evaluation. Can he ride a horse without falling off? Can he hold a conversation with the elderly aunt without insulting anyone? Does he drink too much at dinner? Does he pay appropriate attention to the daughter without being openly inappropriate? Is his valet well trained? Does he tip the servants? Are his boots decent? Every single detail was being logged by someone somewhere in the household. The young man, for his part, was trying to evaluate the family right back. Was this a functional household? Were the parents affectionate or openly hostile? Was the estate as prosperous as advertised? Or were the curtains strategically hiding water damage? Did the daughter speak to her mother with respect, or with barely concealed contempt? What was her singing actually like? Dinner table performances in music rooms could reveal unfortunate truths that no amount of correspondence had disclosed. Ever had to sit through someone's relative playing the harp for 40 minutes while smiling politely? Imagine that, but you might have to live with the harpist. Activities were carefully designed to create controlled opportunities for interaction. A garden walk might include the young couple, a cousin, and an aunt, moving along a path wide enough for 2 but not 3. Conversational groupings shifted strategically. Cards were arranged so that the couple ended up at the same table. Picnics were planned on estates just large enough that the party would naturally fragment into smaller clusters, one of which might include the principal couple and the most lenient chaperone available. None of this was coincidence. It was choreography. Parlour games deserve their own mention because they were genuinely strange. Blind Man's Buff involved one person being blindfolded and tagging others, which, in a room full of adults, created physical contact that would otherwise be forbidden. Forfeit games required participants to perform silly tasks, sometimes including kisses on the cheek, under the pretense of light-hearted fun. These games were one of the few socially acceptable ways for unmarried people to touch each other, and everybody knew it, and everybody pretended they didn't. It was deniability in its purest form. The visit ended with a careful ritual of thanks, gifts left behind, letters exchanged afterward. If it had gone well, a subsequent invitation followed, perhaps for the family to visit the young man's estate. If it had gone poorly, a polite silence descended, and everyone quietly understood that the match was off. Either way, by the time the carriage pulled down the drive, the relationship had either been cemented or buried. A week in a country house decided fates. The afternoon visit was another major courtship venue, and it centred around tea. But tea in the Georgian period was not a casual matter. Tea was expensive, often locked in a special caddy and served with ceremony. The entire performance of preparing and pouring tea was a chance for the young lady of the house to demonstrate her gracefulness, her refinement, and her ability to not spill boiling liquid on a baronet. It was basically a job interview with biscuits. Tea itself was a luxury import, smuggled in large quantities and taxed heavily by the government. A pound of good tea could cost more than a week's wages for a working family. Wealthy households stored it in locked caddies, and the key was kept by the mistress of the house herself, who guarded it with the intensity of a medieval castellan guarding the crown jewels. Servants were not trusted with the tea was counted, the tea was rationed. The tea was treated with the reverence usually reserved for religious relics, because in a sense it was. The ritual of preparation was elaborate. Hot water was brought up from the kitchen in silver pots. The tea leaves were measured carefully from the caddy into the teapot. The tea was allowed to steep for a precise length of time. Cups and saucers, sugar bowls, cream jugs, slop basins and small silver spoons were arranged on the tea table with geometric care. Everything was imported, expensive and fragile. The young lady pouring the tea was performing a ceremony that displayed simultaneously her family's wealth, her own training, and her steadiness of hand. A tremor meant nerves. A spill meant disaster. The conversation during tea was its own structured performance. Topics were chosen carefully. The weather, the health of mutual acquaintances, recent books, local events of mild interest. Politics was avoided. Religion was avoided. Anything personal was avoided unless circled at from a great distance. The suitor was expected to demonstrate that he could hold a polite conversation with the mother, the aunt, the elderly cousin, and the young lady herself all in succession, without appearing bored, forward, or dim. Ever tried to perform at a job interview where the panel includes your potential spouse's entire extended family, and everyone has their own opinion about how you hold a teacup? That was tea. The cakes and biscuits that accompanied tea were another test. A gentleman was not supposed to eat greedily, but also not to refuse, as refusing hospitality was rude. He had to accept one biscuit, nibble it delicately, and not drop crumbs on the upholstery. The upholstery, you see, was also expensive. Everything was expensive. The room itself was essentially a display case of the family's resources, and every object in it was subtly communicating that the daughter came with a certain lifestyle attached. Young women were trained from childhood in the choreography of tea. Mothers drilled their daughters in how to hold the pot, how to offer cream and sugar, how to pass a cup without rattling the saucer. It was the kind of skill that looked effortless only after years of practice, like figure skating in a drawing room. The wrong gesture could reveal inexperience, nervousness, or, worst of all, a lack of breeding. Breeding was the whole point. Breeding was what you were selling. After about an hour, the suitor was expected to rise, offer his thanks, and depart. Staying too long was presumptuous. Leaving too soon was rude. The exact correct length was approximately as long as it took to drink 2 cups of tea and eat 1 small biscuit, which, given the pace of polite conversation, came out to somewhere between 40 minutes and an hour. If he got it right, another invitation would follow. If not, the next knock on the door would be someone else entirely, and the teapot would be warming for a new candidate. No figure in Georgian courtship was more feared, respected, and mildly terrifying than the matchmaking mother. These women possessed encyclopedic knowledge of every eligible bachelor within 100 miles, their incomes, their estates, their rumoured gambling debts, and whether their uncle had died of something embarrassing. A matchmaking mother could engineer an entire romance between 2 people who had barely spoken, using only a strategically arranged dinner party and some very pointed seat assignments. The matchmaking mother was not merely a personality type, she was a social institution. In a world where young people were not permitted to pursue their own romantic interests with any real freedom, someone had to do the pursuing on their behalf, and that someone, overwhelmingly, was the mother. She was the strategist, the negotiator, the intelligence officer, and the closer, all in one. Her daughter was the product. The ballroom was the sales floor. The matchmaking mother was the manager, and she would not be going home until she had moved the inventory. Her information network was extraordinary. She maintained correspondence with other mothers across the country, comparing notes on eligible gentlemen with the enthusiasm of racing enthusiasts comparing horses. She knew whose son had just come into his inheritance, whose nephew had embarrassed himself at Cambridge, whose cousin was unexpectedly back from India with a fortune. She knew who was in debt. She knew who was merely pretending to be rich. She knew which estates were mortgaged and which were secured. Nothing got past her. Modern LinkedIn has nothing on a Georgian mother with her contact book open and her daughter's prospects on the line. Her tactics were subtle but ruthless. A dinner party would be arranged so that the desired suitor was seated next to the daughter, with enough distance from rivals to prevent interference. A carriage ride in the park would be timed so that the family carriage happened to pass the young gentleman's carriage at precisely the right moment. Letters would be written, invitations extended, introductions quietly engineered through friends of friends. The daughter often had no idea how much orchestration was happening behind the scenes. She simply knew that a certain young man kept appearing at events she attended, and he was always smiling. The matchmaking mother could also destroy a budding romance if she decided the suitor wasn't suitable. A lukewarm welcome at the door, an unavailable daughter, a sudden increase in the number of chaperones attending every event, and the young man would quickly understand that he was no longer welcome. No words needed to be spoken. The shutdown was expressed in hundreds of tiny choices, each individually deniable, collectively fatal. It was the original soft blocking, conducted entirely through social calendar manipulation. Novels of the period are full of matchmaking mothers, and most of them are depicted with a mixture of affection and horror. Jane Austen's Mrs. Bennet is the famous example, a woman whose sole purpose in life is to get her 5 daughters married, by any means necessary. Mrs. Bennet is often mocked for her vulgarity, but she is also, in a sense, doing her job. In a society where daughters could not inherit, could not work, and could not remain unmarried without becoming dependent, A matchmaking mother was the difference between her children's comfort and their slow descent into genteel poverty. Her desperation was real. Her methods were what they had to be. Not all matchmaking mothers were mercenary. Some genuinely wanted their daughters to be happy and balanced financial practicality with an eye toward emotional compatibility. Others simply wanted grandchildren. A few were so overwhelming that their daughters ended up marrying the first acceptable man who proposed simply to escape the house. Mothers were the architects of Georgian marriages, and the architecture, whether graceful or grotesque, was almost always theirs. Before anyone actually got married, a great deal of negotiation took place that had nothing to do with feelings. Lawyers for both families would sit down to hammer out the marriage settlement, which determined the dowry, the pin money, the jointure, and a whole vocabulary of financial terms that were, in essence, a prenup. The dowry was what the woman brought to the marriage. The jointure was what she'd receive if her husband died. Everything was discussed, itemized, and occasionally argued over for months. Romance. The dowry was the headline number. It could be cash, it could be land, it could be shares in a business, it could be a combination. A daughter of a wealthy family might come with tens of thousands of pounds, which was a staggering sum in a world where a comfortable middle-class income was a few £100s a year. A daughter of a less wealthy family might come with a few thousand, or just a modest sum and some furniture. The size of the dowry did not guarantee a happy marriage, but it profoundly shaped who would even consider proposing in the first place. Eligible bachelors, like modern hedge fund managers, had minimums. Pin money was the allowance a wife received from her husband for her personal expenses, and it was a fiercely negotiated item. A good marriage settlement locked in a pin money clause that couldn't be reduced by a stingy husband later. Without it, a woman might have to beg her own spouse for every shilling she needed for clothes, books, or charitable giving. A woman with pin money was a woman with at least a small measure of financial autonomy. A woman without it was, in a very real sense, dependent on her husband's mood. The jointure was the widow's safety net. If the husband died, the jointure guaranteed the wife a certain annual income for the rest of her life, regardless of what else happened to the estate. This was important because estates often passed intact to the eldest son, and without a jointure, a widow could find herself suddenly without a home or an income, dependent on the generosity of her own child. A well-drafted jointure could prevent years of genteel misery. A poorly drafted one could leave a widow moving between the spare rooms of her relatives, tolerated and resentful. The lawyers involved in all this were serious professionals who took their time. Negotiations could drag on for weeks or months. Clauses were added and removed. Provisions for potential children were included. Agreements were made about what would happen if certain property changed value, if certain relatives died, if certain conditions were or were not met. Imagine signing a mortgage, a life insurance policy, and a divorce contract simultaneously while wearing silk, and you begin to get the flavour. The young couple, meanwhile, had very little say in any of this. In most cases, the settlement was negotiated by their fathers, with the groom sometimes consulted and the bride almost never. She might not even know the final figures until the settlement was read aloud to her on her wedding day. Her future financial security was being determined by men in a room she wasn't allowed to enter, using a vocabulary she had likely never been educated in. Consent was technically required, in that she had to agree to marry the man, but the details of what that marriage would look like financially were handled elsewhere. And yet, the system did provide some protections that modern women had to fight to regain centuries later. A well-negotiated Georgian settlement could actually secure a woman's property against her husband's debts, preserve her income during the marriage, and guarantee her future after his death. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't fair. But for a woman in an era without divorce, property rights, or employment options, it was the only scaffolding keeping her from collapse. Love was the bonus round. The settlement was the actual deal. When a man finally got around to proposing, it usually happened in a drawing room during a carefully arranged private moment, with the door left deliberately ajar to preserve propriety. The proposal itself was often brief, nervous, and heavily scripted. Some men rehearsed their proposals for weeks. Some men went to propose and accidentally proposed to the wrong sister. This is not a joke. It happened. Usually the proposal was less about poetic declarations and more about confirming that both families had already agreed to the thing 3 weeks ago. The actual mechanics of getting into the room were delicate. A gentleman would typically request a private interview with the young lady, which itself signalled his intentions to everyone in the household. The mother would conspicuously arrange to be elsewhere. The sisters would be banished, though probably eavesdropping from behind a door. The father was usually already aware, having been approached earlier to grant his consent, which was not legally required after a certain age but was socially expected. By the time the young couple found themselves alone in the drawing room, everyone else in the building already knew what was about to happen. The language of the proposal itself tended toward the formal. Men did not usually drop to one knee, despite what costume dramas suggest. They stood, sometimes paced, took a deep breath, and made a speech. These speeches were often surprisingly businesslike, covering the suitor's affection for the young lady, his financial prospects, his intentions regarding a future household, and his hope that she would consent to becoming his wife. Some were eloquent, many were not. Plenty of young men, overcome by the moment, stumbled through their prepared remarks, forgot their lines, and ended with a wretched silence while the young lady waited, horrified and sympathetic. The ring situation is worth clarifying. The engagement ring as a mandatory diamond was not yet a Georgian convention. Some couples exchange rings at engagement, often sentimental pieces like pearl rings or rings set with the suitor's hair. Diamonds were sometimes used, but they were not the overwhelming default. The real engagement token was often a portrait miniature, a small painted likeness of the intended, set in a locket or a case. These were commissioned, painted, and exchanged as proof of serious intent. Imagine giving someone your selfie, but the selfie took 6 weeks to make and cost a month's wages. The response was technically the young lady's to give, but in practice, it had usually been agreed in advance. A woman might still refuse, but refusing at this stage was dramatic and somewhat embarrassing for all involved. Acceptance was often softly indicated rather than explicitly stated. A murmured yes, a nod, a hand extended, a small, composed smile. Weeping, fainting, and declarations of lifelong passion were not the norm. Georgian proposals were, for the most part, dignified conversations that ended in a firm, quiet agreement. The passion, if any, came later. The proposal to the wrong sister incident deserves special attention, because it happened more than once in the historical record. With chaperones, dim lighting, similar dresses, and strong family resemblance, a nervous gentleman occasionally declared his undying love to a young woman who was absolutely not the one he had intended to marry. The ensuing awkwardness, as the sisters exchanged glances and the suitor realized his error, is the stuff of family legend. Some couples actually ended up married this way, pivoting mid-proposal to the correct sister who had apparently been interested all along. Once accepted, the news was announced, first to the parents, then to close relatives, and eventually to the broader social circle through written announcements and word of mouth. The couple was now officially engaged, which carried weight and obligation. From this moment forward, breaking the engagement would require serious cause and possibly legal consequences. The proposal had been made, the answer had been given. The machinery of the wedding was already grinding into motion before the door to the drawing room had even fully closed behind them. A woman could, technically, refuse a proposal, but the social consequences varied wildly depending on her circumstances. If she was a wealthy heiress with many options, she could say no with a gracious smile and wait for the next candidate. If she was the fifth daughter of a country clergyman with limited prospects, saying no to a reasonable offer might mean a lifetime of being the strange aunt who lives upstairs and knits obsessively. The pressure to accept was often immense, and not always gentle. The mathematics of refusal were cold. A young woman considering a proposal had to weigh the man she was being offered against every other man who might theoretically propose in the future, and calculate whether another offer was likely to arrive. If she was beautiful, wealthy, and well-connected, she could afford to be choosy. If she was plain, poor, or from a family with too many unmarried daughters already, she might be looking at a single realistic offer in her lifetime. Refusing it meant refusing marriage itself, which in this era meant refusing a home, an income, and a social role. That was a lot to refuse for reasons like he smells funny, or his laugh is slightly unsettling. Family pressure was enormous and often overt. Parents who had watched a daughter reach her mid-20s without attracting serious suitors were not inclined to let her refuse a man with a decent income and a functional pulse. Mothers wept, fathers lectured, aunts appeared unexpectedly to offer counsel. The household's collective disappointment could become a physical presence in the dining room, a wait on every meal. Imagine your entire extended family deciding the man you're dating is fine, actually, and holding a family meeting about it every Sunday for 6 months. The suitor himself sometimes did not take refusal well. A gentleman who had been confident of acceptance and was instead turned down could respond with wounded pride, angry letters, or in extreme cases, public accusations that the young lady had led him on. These accusations could damage her reputation significantly, especially if he had witnesses who could confirm earlier flirtations. Breaking off an engagement, or refusing after long courtship, exposed a woman to charges of being a coquette, a flirt, or worse. The legal term breach of promise had teeth and occasionally bit. Still, some women did refuse, and some refused even advantageous matches. The reasons varied. Sometimes the suitor was known to be cruel, a heavy drinker or a gambler. Sometimes there was another, less suitable man she preferred and was holding out for. Sometimes she genuinely could not face the prospect of spending her life with the person standing in front of her and decided that spinsterhood, for all its disadvantages, was preferable to waking up every morning next to someone she disliked. Those refusals took courage. The phrasing of a refusal was its own art form. A direct no was considered harsh and could humiliate the man permanently. The preferred approach was to express regret, to cite inadequacy, to explain that she could not give him the affection he deserved, to wish him well in his future happiness, and to hope that they might remain friends. Every word was chosen to cushion his pride, while still being absolutely unambiguous in the final answer. Ever had to reject someone through carefully worded condolence? This was a society that had formalized that skill. The aftermath was awkward. The refused suitor typically left town for a while, nursed his wounds, and eventually found another prospect. The family of the refusing lady closed ranks, politely but firmly, insisting that it had been a difficult decision, and that everyone involved was simply unsuited. The lady herself often spent the following weeks writing justifications in her diary, reassuring herself that she'd done the right thing, and quietly hoping that her courage would not turn out to have been expensive. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it did. Either way, she'd exercised one of the very few choices Georgian society allowed her, and she would live with the consequences for the rest of her life. Georgian courtships frequently involved age gaps that today would raise significant eyebrows and possibly legal concerns. It was not at all unusual for a man in his 40s to court a woman in her late teens, especially if he was wealthy and she was not. These matches were often framed as practical. He had an established estate, she had youth and fertility, and both families could pretend this was romantic. In reality, a great many young women walked down the aisle to a man who remembered their father's school days. The arithmetic was stark. A man in his 40s in the 18th century was often a widower, his first wife having died in childbirth or of illness. He had an established income, perhaps children from the earlier marriage, and a need for someone to manage the household and, pointedly, produce an heir if he didn't have one yet. A young woman in her late teens or early 20s fit the specifications perfectly. She was healthy, trainable, and young enough to bear the children he needed. The match was not typically described as an age gap. It was described as suitable. The young woman's feelings about this arrangement were, predictably, not the central concern. She might be introduced to her prospective husband and discover that he was 25 years her senior, balding, stout, and set in his ways. If her family approved, and if he had the income to make her future comfortable, her preferences were a secondary matter. She might be told that affection would grow in time, that his gentle nature would make him a kind husband, and that his wealth would provide her with security she could not otherwise expect. These consolations were offered in the same tone used to recommend cod liver oil. The social dynamics within such a marriage were peculiar. A young wife in her 20s might find herself managing a household that included adult stepchildren closer to her own age than her husband was. Stepchildren often resented the new wife, especially if she was young enough to be their sister. Household staff, many of whom had served the previous wife, had to adjust to taking orders from a woman they might have watched grow up. Dinner tables could become quiet battlefields of glances and withheld comments. Conversation was another casualty. A man who had spent his youth during one era, and a woman who had spent hers during another had startlingly little common ground. References did not land. Jokes did not translate. The young wife who tried to discuss the latest novel might be met with a patient smile and a reference to a book published before she was born. The older husband who tried to explain the political intrigues of his youth might receive a polite nod from a wife who'd been an infant during the events in question. They lived in the same house, but, in a quiet way, in different centuries. And yet some of these marriages genuinely worked. An older man who had learned some patience with age, who had outgrown the impulsiveness of his 20s, could sometimes be a more considerate husband than a younger man would have been. A young wife who had been spared a contemporary husband's immaturity sometimes found real companionship with a spouse who treated her with respect and kindness. The gap was not always a wound. It was simply a condition, and some couples found ways to make it livable. But the reverse pairing, an older woman marrying a younger man, was rare and heavily stigmatized. A widow in her 40s who married a man in his 20s was considered faintly ridiculous, often accused of foolishness or moral weakness, and mocked in newspapers and pamphlets. The male prerogative to marry young was not extended to women. Her age was her deficit. His age was merely his character. The double standard was not new. The Georgian simply made it architecturally explicit. The age gap was only socially acceptable in one direction, and that direction was always downward, from older men to younger women, without exception and without apology. Marrying your cousin was not only acceptable in Georgian England, it was often encouraged. Keeping wealth, property and titles within the family was considered eminently sensible. First cousin marriages were legal, relatively common, and frequently celebrated as tidy solutions to otherwise messy inheritance problems. Genetic diversity was not yet a widely understood concept, and the family tree often resembled a family topiary, with branches that looped back on themselves in unexpected ways. The logic was ruthlessly practical. If your eldest son needed to marry well, and your brother's daughter came with a substantial dowry that happened to include land adjoining your own, The solution presented itself with the elegance of a well-balanced ledger. 2 estates could be consolidated, family fortunes could be doubled, titles that might otherwise have to be split among distant relations could be kept in the direct line. From the perspective of a landowner worrying about the future of an estate built up over 3 centuries, a cousin marriage was not unusual or awkward. It was responsible planning. Children in families with these kinds of aspirations often grew up knowing who they might eventually marry. Cousins of compatible ages were brought together frequently at family gatherings, encouraged to play together as children, and later to dance together as young adults. A girl might spend her summers at her uncle's estate from the age of 7 onward, gradually forming a familiar bond with her male cousin, and by the time they were both eligible to marry, the transition from childhood companion to spouse was, to everyone else at least, seamless. It was the original arranged marriage, conducted entirely within the punch bowl at family birthdays. Emotionally, these matches were a mixed bag. Some cousin couples had known each other their entire lives and genuinely liked each other. They shared references, inside jokes, mutual childhood memories, and a comfort with the family's specific eccentricities. That kind of familiarity could be a real foundation for a functional marriage. Other cousin couples had grown up practically as siblings and approached their wedding night with a confusion and reluctance that no wedding breakfast could quite dispel. Turning someone you remember as a sticky-fingered 8-year-old into your romantic partner required some mental adjustment. The medical consequences were beginning to be noticed, even without modern genetics. Families that repeatedly intermarried sometimes produced children with unusual health problems, fragile constitutions, or conditions that recurred with suspicious regularity across generations. Physicians of the era occasionally commented on the sickliness of certain aristocratic lines, though they tended to blame it on fashionable diets, bad air, or moral failings rather than the family tree. The actual mechanism, recessive genes meeting their matches in closely related spouses, was centuries away from being understood, but the effects were visible to anyone paying attention. Fiction of the period frequently featured cousin marriages, reflecting how normal they were in real life. Jane Austen's novels include several cousin relationships, some approved, some not, all treated as entirely within the range of possible outcomes. In Mansfield Park, the protagonist marries her first cousin, and the book presents this as the happy ending. In Wuthering Heights, published slightly later, the cousin entanglements reach operatic levels of dysfunction, but nobody questions whether they are allowed. They simply are. The custom persisted well into the 19th century before beginning to fall out of fashion, partly due to gradual awareness of hereditary illness, and partly due to shifting social attitudes about the intimacy of cousin relationships. By the Victorian era, it was still legal and not uncommon, but it had started to feel slightly old-fashioned, like wearing knee breeches to a dinner. In its Georgian heyday, though, marrying a cousin was not a quirk or a secret. It was often the plan, laid down at your christening and executed at your wedding some 20 years later, with the full approval of absolutely everyone involved. For those who couldn't get parental approval, there was always Gretna Green, a small village just across the Scottish border, where couples could marry without the waiting periods, bans and parental consent required in England. Elopements to Gretna Green became a Georgian institution, complete with a roaring trade in blacksmiths who performed quick marriage ceremonies. Running off to Gretna Green was romantic, rebellious, and genuinely scandalous, and it occasionally ended with a father catching up and hauling his daughter back in a carriage. The legal loophole was straightforward. English marriage law, codified in 1753, required banns to be read in church for 3 consecutive weeks before a wedding, or a special license to bypass the bans, and for anyone under 21 to have parental consent. Scottish marriage law had no such requirements. A couple only needed to declare their intention to marry in front of witnesses, and the marriage was legally binding. Gretna Green happened to be the first significant village on the Scottish side of the main road north from England, which turned it, almost overnight, into a booming wedding destination. The blacksmiths of Gretna Green became legendary figures in this trade. Any adult could officiate a Scottish marriage, and the local smiths, being visible, reliable, and conveniently located near the main crossroads, fell into the role. The blacksmith's anvil became the symbolic altar, the hammer blow, a metaphor for the forging of two lives together. Some couples found the whole thing charmingly rustic. Others, staring at a sooty tradesman in a leather apron, wondered whether this was really how they had pictured their wedding day. Either way, the paperwork worked. The journey itself was an ordeal. From London, a couple would have to travel by post-chaise at tremendous expense, changing horses frequently, racing north as fast as hired coachmen could manage. The trip took several days of near-continuous travel, during which the couple had to stop at inns for meals and sleep while constantly looking over their shoulders for pursuit. Angry fathers, if they discovered the elopement quickly enough, could chase after them with a carriage of their own, and the race became a literal one. Several of the most famous elopements ended with the groom's carriage arriving at Gretna Green mere minutes before the father's. Some ended with the father winning. Reputations did not always recover. A woman who eloped, even successfully, carried the stain of her impulsiveness for the rest of her life. Polite society forgave many things, but rarely forgave a bride who had humiliated her parents by running off. Invitations might be quietly withdrawn, acquaintances might become distant. Even a happy marriage that followed a Gretna Green wedding could be shadowed by years of whispered disapproval. For some couples, this was a price worth paying. For others, it turned out to be steeper than they had anticipated. The phenomenon inspired a whole subgenre of fiction, cartoons, and popular ballads. Plays featured desperate lovers galloping north while villainous fathers pursued them. Newspapers reported the latest high-profile elopements with the gleeful relish of modern tabloids. Gretna Green became shorthand for reckless romance, and the very word suggested passion triumphing, or at least attempting to triumph, over calculation. The real elopements were messier, more uncertain and less photogenic than the stories suggested, but the stories persisted because people loved them. Not every elopement was a love story. Fortune hunters, men specifically interested in a young woman's inheritance, sometimes persuaded naive heiresses to elope in order to secure a marriage before her family could intervene and block the union legally. Once married, the new husband had legal control of her fortune, and there was no undoing it. Gretna Green, for all its romantic glamour, was also the setting for some genuinely cynical acts of financial capture, dressed up as love stories so that everyone involved could pretend the outcome was what they had wanted all along. A woman's reputation was the single most valuable thing she possessed, more valuable than her dowry, her face, or her ability to play the harpsichord. A single rumour, a single observed moment of impropriety could destroy her marriage prospects entirely. Being seen alone with a man, even briefly, could be enough. Letters intercepted, gossip passed along at a tea, a whispered accusation at a ball. These were the weapons of social destruction, and they were wielded with terrifying enthusiasm. The fragility was the point. A reputation built up over years of careful behaviour could collapse in an afternoon. A young woman who had done nothing wrong could find her marriage prospects in ruins because someone had seen her emerging from a garden at dusk with a gentleman who was not her brother and drawn conclusions. The conclusions did not have to be correct. They just had to be told. Ever had a group chat decide something about your life that wasn't true and refuse to let it go? Imagine that, but the group chat is the entire county. The rules were exacting and largely unwritten, which made them harder to follow. Being alone in a room with a man was bad, Being alone in a carriage with a man was worse. Riding a horse through a field with a man, with no other riders in sight, was a full-blown crisis. Dancing more than twice with the same man in an evening suggested impropriety. Writing letters to a man you were not engaged to was considered forward. Accepting gifts of jewellery from a man who was not a relative was deeply suspicious. The vocabulary of scandal was enormous, and every woman was expected to know all of it by instinct. The consequences of a damaged reputation were immediate and durable. Invitations stopped arriving. Acquaintances became distant. Gentlemen who had been courting vanished without explanation. Younger sisters found their own prospects dimmed by association. The family, rather than defending the accused daughter, often closed ranks against her, sending her to a remote relative in the country until the storm blew over, if it ever did. In severe cases, a young woman might be packed off to live with an aunt permanently, her social life effectively over before her 25th birthday. Men faced no comparable risk. A gentleman who had been involved in a scandal might suffer a brief reputational dip, but could generally recover fully by travelling to the continent for a year, returning tanned and eligible. The same incident that destroyed a young woman's life might actually enhance a young man's reputation among his peers, who regarded his exploits with admiration rather than horror. This imbalance was so entrenched it barely registered as unfair. It was simply the weather. Everyone accepted it. Gossip was the engine of the reputation economy, and it ran constantly. Letters between female relatives across the country spread news of scandals faster than any newspaper could. Servants talked. Ladies' maids shared information in the kitchens. Visiting cousins carried stories across counties. By the time a young woman realised her reputation was in trouble, the damage had often already been done in places she had never even visited. Attempts to correct the record usually failed, because the correction never travelled as far or as fast as the original accusation. The defences available to an accused woman were meagre. She could weep, she could protest, she could have her mother write letters to selected friends insisting on her innocence. She could have her father demand an apology from whoever had started the rumour, though this often made things worse by drawing more attention to the story. The single most effective defence was marriage. Any marriage as quickly as possible, because a married woman was considered more insulated from gossip than an unmarried one. Plenty of hasty Georgian weddings had reputation management as their primary purpose, with love as the garnish. The reputation economy was merciless, arbitrary and absolute, and every young woman alive under it learned to navigate its currents or sink beneath them. Every courtship drama needed a villain, and the Georgian period produced them by the dozen. The rake, as he was called, was a man of charm, wealth, and deeply questionable intentions. He attended the same balls, danced the same dances, wrote the same flattering letters, but his goal was rarely marriage. Novels of the period were filled with dire warnings about rakes, and every debutante was drilled, often by her mother, on how to spot one, how to avoid one, and what to do if she had unfortunately already fallen for one. The archetype was consistent across decades. A rake was typically well-born, well-funded, and well-educated. He had spent time at university without graduating, travelled the continent on what was euphemistically called the Grand Tour, and returned with opinions, fashionable clothes, and an impressive familiarity with gambling houses, brothels, and the specific cocktails of scandals available in Paris. He was often handsome in the way that expensive things are handsome. He was also frequently broke, because his lifestyle had burned through whatever inheritance he'd been allotted, and he needed a rich wife to refill the coffers. His tactics were well documented, in part because novelists kept writing exposés about them. A rake would single out a young woman with a significant dowry, typically one who seemed a little less chaperoned than the others. He would pay her intense and focused attention, making her feel as if she were the most fascinating person in the room. He would dance with her twice, send her small gifts, and quote poetry to her in a voice pitched low enough that no one else could hear. Ever had someone love-bomb you in the first week? Georgian rakes essentially invented the technique minus the social media. The goal varied. Some rakes genuinely intended to marry their target, purely for the money, and planned to resume their dissipated lifestyle immediately after the wedding, leaving the new wife to manage a country estate alone while he returned to London. Others had no intention of marrying at all, and hoped only to compromise the young woman's reputation enough to either extract money from her family or convince her to run away with him as his mistress. The really bad ones combined strategies and adjusted their plans based on which approach seemed likeliest to work. Mothers were the first line of defence. A vigilant mother investigated every serious suitor thoroughly, writing to friends in London to ask about his gambling debts, his drinking habits, his previous entanglements, and his general reputation among the people who actually knew him. A suitor who charmed the drawing room but whose references came back ambiguous was quietly frozen out, with the daughter sometimes never told exactly why. The mother simply engineered the end of the connection, and the daughter often spent years wondering what had happened to the delightful Mr. Whomever, unaware that her mother had saved her life. Novels played a major role in spreading rake awareness. Samuel Richardson's Clarissa, published in the 1740s, featured Lovelace, one of the most famous fictional rakes in English literature, a charming predator who destroys the life of the virtuous heroine across thousands of pages. Every young woman who could read was encouraged to read such books, not for entertainment, but for education. The lesson was the same every time. A man who seemed too attentive, too eloquent, too enthusiastic, too early was almost certainly dangerous, and running in the opposite direction was the correct response. Still, plenty of young women fell for rakes anyway, because the warnings sometimes made the rakes more interesting rather than less. The forbidden quality had its own pull. Some of these involvements ended in heartbreak, ruined reputations and quiet retreats to the country. Others, remarkably, ended in rakes actually reforming, settling down and becoming moderately respectable husbands. The novels almost never allowed this outcome, but real life was messier than fiction, and even Georgian villains occasionally grew up. A great deal of Georgian courtship involved the exchange of poetry, and let's be honest, most of it was terrible. Men who could barely spell attempted to compose sonnets, comparing their beloved's complexion to moonlight, her voice to nightingales, her hair to things that hair does not actually resemble. Women received these poems with varying degrees of delight, horror, and secret mockery with their sisters later. Some of the poems were sincere. Most were copied, sometimes directly from books of pre-written courtship verse. Plagiarism was rampant and widely tolerated. The market for pre-written love poetry was enormous. Entire books were published containing verses on every possible romantic subject, organized by theme and occasion. A gentleman could leaf through a volume and select, say, a suitable poem for a lady whose name began with the letter E, whose hair was auburn, whose eyes were blue, and with whom he had danced 2 weeks prior at a country ball. He would copy out the selected verse in his own hand, perhaps alter a word or two, sign it as if it had sprung from his own heart, and send it off. The young lady, meanwhile, might have the exact same book on her shelf and recognise the poem immediately. Some women did not comment. Others saved the matching verse to show to their sisters later. The laughter, apparently, was tremendous. The themes were spectacularly predictable. Her eyes were always stars, occasionally moons, very occasionally suns. Her cheeks were always roses, sometimes lilies if the poet was feeling creative. Her voice was always a nightingale, her figure always a willow, her hair always gold even when it was visibly brown. The poet's heart was always pierced, wounded, burning, melting, or some combination of these calamities. The poet himself was usually described as dying slowly of his affections, which, given the robust health most of these young men displayed at balls and shooting parties, was clearly an exaggeration. The rhymes could be genuinely painful. 18th century English offered a limited number of words that rhyme easily, and the same pairings appeared again and again. Heart rhymed with dart, with part with smart. Love rhymed with dove, with above. Sigh rhymed with I, with die. A young lady could usually predict the next line of a love poem before reading it, and the game became one of confirming rather than discovering. Ever received a message from someone that clearly used autocomplete for every word? Same feeling 3 centuries earlier. Women sometimes wrote poetry in return, though they were held to different standards. A lady's verse had to be accomplished enough to demonstrate refinement, but not so bold as to seem unwomanly. Writing too well could backfire. A young woman who composed genuinely clever poetry risked being labelled a bluestocking, a derogatory term for an intellectually inclined woman, which in Georgian terms was a social liability roughly equivalent to having a visible tattoo. The ideal was a poem that was technically correct, mildly flattering to its recipient, and not quite good enough to threaten his ego. Calibrated mediocrity was a skill. The best courtship poetry of the period was written by the people who were actually good at it, and it has survived in anthologies. The vast majority, however, was written by young men with sincere feelings and no measurable talent, and has thankfully been lost to time. Some of these dreadful verses did end up preserved in family papers, tucked into diaries or bound into commonplace books, and occasionally get published centuries later as curiosities, where they serve mainly to remind readers that bad writing is a timeless human activity. Still, the exchange of poetry served a real function, even when the poetry itself was wretched. It was a way of declaring serious interest, of putting intentions on paper, of creating a record of affection that both parties could reread later. The words themselves mattered less than the effort of sending them. A clumsy poem sincerely written was, in its own strange way, a gift, even if the recipient had to try very hard not to laugh while reading it. Information was currency, and gossip was the exchange. Every social event, every visit, every observed interaction was catalogued, analysed and shared across a vast informal network of aunts, cousins and servants. The servants in particular knew everything. A lady's maid knew whose letters her mistress was reading. A footman knew which gentleman had called and for how long. Gossip travelled from the kitchen to the parlour to the next county over, and by the time it reached its destination, it had usually become a considerably more interesting story. The servant intelligence network was formidable. Ladies' maids dressed their mistresses and heard every unguarded remark. Footmen carried letters and knew who wrote to whom. Valets saw the condition of their masters' returning boots, and could deduce a great deal about where they had been. Cooks overheard conversations at breakfast. Grooms watched which carriages stopped outside which houses. None of these workers were necessarily gossiping maliciously. They were simply talking to each other in their own quarters, and the combined information flowed upstairs in the form of subtly dropped hints from one servant to another mistress, and eventually into the drawing room as common knowledge. The pipeline from kitchen to parlour was remarkably efficient. A young lady might think she had concealed her correspondence with certain gentlemen, only to discover that her mother already knew, because her mother's lady's maid had a sister who worked in the kitchen of the young lady's house, and the sister had seen the sealed letters on the hall table. Nothing escaped this network. Even the most carefully kept secret tended to leak, because the household in which it was supposedly hidden was populated by a dozen professional observers who had nowhere else to direct their attention. Female correspondents carried the gossip further. Women wrote letters to each other constantly. sometimes daily, and these letters served as the period's equivalent of a dedicated news feed. A juicy scandal in Bath could be described in full detail in a letter to a cousin in Yorkshire within days. The cousin would then describe it to her own social circle. Within 2 weeks, a story might traverse the entire country, embellished slightly at each retelling, until the original event became almost unrecognisable, but no less widely accepted as true. The content of gossip was varied and often banal. Who had been seen walking with whom in Hyde Park? Whose daughter had been crying at a ball and why? Which family's finances were rumoured to be in trouble? Whose son had lost too much at cards the previous week? Whose neighbour was drinking too much? The vast majority of this material was mundane and would be instantly forgettable today. But in a society without telephones, newspapers of limited reach, and no other forms of mass communication, gossip was how people maintained their mental maps of their social world. Targeted gossip could be weaponized. A mother who disapproved of a match could spread strategic doubts about a suitor's character, letting a few chosen friends know, in strictest confidence of course, that she had heard certain things about his previous behaviour. These friends would repeat the information, again in strictest confidence, until the entire social circle had absorbed the message without anyone being quite sure where it originated. The targeted young man might find himself mysteriously shut out of invitations with no one willing to tell him why. Reputations were assassinated this way on a regular basis, quietly and efficiently. Yet the gossip network also had a protective function. A predatory rake whose activities became known could be identified and warned about through the same channels. A suspicious financial situation could be flagged before a daughter was committed to a ruinous marriage. The network was a double-edged sword, capable of both destroying innocent reputations and saving young women from disasters they would otherwise have walked into blindly. It was flawed, it was unfair, it was often malicious, but it was also, in a society without formal information systems, the only intelligence service available. Everyone feared it, and everyone participated in it. Let's pause for a moment of honesty about the sensory reality of Georgian courtship. Regular bathing was not common. Deodorant did not exist. Dental care was rudimentary at best. Many people had missing teeth, bad breath, and skin conditions that no amount of lace could hide. People covered themselves in perfumes, powders, and scented waters, which layered over everything else created an atmosphere in crowded ballrooms that would, by modern standards, make your eyes water. Romance bloomed regardless, because no one had a baseline for better. Bathing was infrequent and complicated. A full bath required large quantities of water, which had to be heated over a fire and carried into a tub, a process that took hours and required several servants. Most people bathed fully only occasionally, preferring to wash specific parts of the body with a basin of water and a cloth as needed. Linen undergarments were changed more frequently, which was considered the main method of staying clean. The idea was that the linen absorbed the body's oils and smells, and swapping the linen was equivalent to washing. It was not, as any modern nose would confirm, equivalent to washing. Teeth were a widespread problem. Sugar had become cheap and widely consumed in the 18th century, and its effects on dental health were catastrophic. Many people in their 20s had already lost several teeth. Those who still had most of theirs often suffered from visible decay, and the pain of untreated cavities was a constant companion. Toothbrushes existed but were not universally used. Some people rubbed their teeth with a cloth, or a mixture of crushed charcoal and herbs, or nothing at all. Mouthwash did not exist. Breath, at close range, was an experience. Perfume was applied aggressively. Both men and women doused themselves in scented waters, oils and powders, partly to signal wealth and partly to mask whatever else was going on. The perfumes themselves were often heavy and complex, layering florals over musks over spices. In a well-ventilated room, they could be pleasant. In a crowded, overheated ballroom full of several hundred perfumed people, the combined effect was overpowering. Some accounts describe headaches, fainting, and nausea among guests at grand events, attributed vaguely to the stuffiness, which was a polite way of blaming the smell. Skin conditions went largely untreated. Acne, eczema, rashes, and the lingering scars of smallpox were extremely common. White lead makeup, used to create a fashionably pale complexion, actively damaged the skin it was meant to beautify, creating a cycle in which women applied more makeup to hide the damage caused by the earlier makeup. Beauty patches covered the worst spots. Fans covered the rest. A lady of the upper classes might spend hours at her dressing table preparing to appear in public, and the result, while carefully constructed, concealed considerable underlying damage. Lace were a quiet but universal feature of daily life. Powdered wigs, so iconic of the period, were in fact prime real estate for various parasites, and the powder itself attracted mice as well as insects. Women's elaborate hairstyles, often built up on wire frames and kept in place for days or weeks, became miniature ecosystems. Scratching was common, and there were even small decorative tools called back scratchers used for exactly this purpose in polite company. Everyone was itchy. Everyone pretended they weren't. Despite all of this, people fell in love and desired each other with the same intensity humans have always felt. The crucial point is that their frame of reference was their own era. They had never experienced the scent-neutral environment of a modern air-conditioned room. They had never met someone who smelled of soap and nothing else. What would strike a modern visitor as appalling was to them simply the background texture of daily life, no more noticeable than traffic noises to a modern city dweller. Love adapted, romance adapted, noses adapted, and the ballrooms filled anyway. Once engaged, a couple entered a strange legal and social limbo. They were not yet married, but they were no longer fully free. A broken engagement was a serious matter and could result in legal action, particularly breach of promise lawsuits, which allowed jilted fiancé to sue for damages. Men thinking of calling things off had to consider not just the social consequences, but the very real possibility of being dragged into court and forced to pay significant sums. Love, it turned out, came with invoices. Breach of promise suits were genuinely effective legal instruments. A woman who had been promised marriage, with witnesses, letters, or family negotiations to prove it, could sue a man who backed out of the engagement for financial damages. The logic of the suit was that a broken engagement damaged a young woman's reputation, her marital prospects, and potentially her future, since she had taken herself off the marriage market for the duration of the engagement and was now returning to it slightly used. Juries, often sympathetic, awarded substantial sums. Some men were financially ruined by these cases. The social dynamics during an engagement were also awkward. The couple was expected to behave as if they were nearly married, spending more time together, receiving joint invitations, and being treated by their circle as a unit. At the same time, they were not allowed the physical or emotional intimacy of actual marriage. Chaperones were still required, though sometimes slightly more relaxed. Letters could be slightly warmer in tone, but not by much. The engaged couple lived in a transitional state that combined the restrictions of courtship with the expectations of marriage, without the privileges of either. Practical preparations consumed the engagement period. The wedding itself had to be planned, though Georgian weddings were generally more modest than modern ones. The trousseau, the collection of linens, clothing, and household goods the bride brought to her new home, had to be assembled, often over several months of sewing and shopping. A proper trousseau could include dozens of nightgowns, chemises, petticoats, and household linens, all typically hand-embroidered with the bride's new initials. It was a significant production, and the bride's female relatives often gathered to help with the sewing. The suitor's financial situation came under fresh scrutiny during the engagement period. Even after the settlement had been signed, if new information emerged about debts, gambling losses, or other financial problems, the bride's family might reconsider. An engagement was easier to break than a marriage. More than one engagement ended when a quiet investigation by the bride's uncle revealed that the fiancé owed several £1,000s to various creditors he had not previously mentioned. The engagement would dissolve, the breach of promise threat notwithstanding, because the alternative, marrying into actual ruin, was worse than the legal and social fallout of calling it off. The emotional weight of engagement was considerable. Some couples genuinely grew closer during this period, their conversations deepening as they contemplated a shared future. Others discovered, to their alarm, that the person they were about to marry was not quite who they had thought during the controlled environment of courtship. With slightly more freedom to interact, subtle incompatibilities emerged. She was less charming than he had believed. He was more rigid than she had expected. Cold feet were not a modern invention. They were a Georgian epidemic, quietly hidden behind forced smiles and polite confirmations. Some engagements were long, lasting a year or more, usually because the groom was finishing his education, inheriting property, or waiting for a military commission. Long engagements tested the resolve of both parties and occasionally failed to survive the test. Short engagements, sometimes just a few weeks, carried the opposite risk. The couple had not known each other long enough to discover problems that would later become apparent. Either way, once the engagement had been announced, the couple was committed to seeing it through or paying socially, financially and personally to escape it. You might expect Georgian weddings to be enormous, lavish affairs, but actually, most were surprisingly small and quiet. A typical wedding took place in the morning, at the local parish church, with only close family present. The bride wore her best dress, which was not necessarily white. The whole thing took less than an hour. Afterwards, there was often a wedding breakfast, which was neither a breakfast nor particularly elaborate by our standards. It was really just the necessary paperwork of marriage, performed in public. The legal framework was specific. Under the Marriage Act of 1753, English weddings had to be performed in a Church of England parish church between the hours of 8 in the morning and noon, with banns read or a licence obtained, and in the presence of at least 2 witnesses. These requirements were strict and designed to prevent the clandestine marriages that had been a problem in earlier decades. A couple could not simply declare themselves married in a private drawing room. The ceremony had to be public, legal, and in the correct place. This is why morning weddings became the standard, and why afternoon and evening ceremonies, now so common, were essentially impossible. The bride's dress was whatever she considered her best gown, often a dress in a colour she could continue to wear afterward. White wedding dresses as a universal tradition did not become standard until the Victorian era, popularised by Queen Victoria's 1840 wedding. Georgian brides wore blue, green, yellow, pink, or whatever flattering colour suited them. The dress might be new, or it might be a reworked gown from a previous occasion. Wealthier brides sometimes commissioned dresses specifically for the wedding, but even these were expected to be worn again afterward, not preserved as single-use garments. The guest list was typically small. Close family, a few intimate friends, perhaps the witnesses required by law. The grand society weddings with hundreds of guests were a later invention. Most Georgian weddings had attendance in the low dozens at most. The ceremony itself was the standard Anglican wedding service, with its familiar vows and declarations. It was conducted in ordinary language, not dramatic spectacle. The couple said their lines, the minister pronounced them married, the register was signed, and that was the wedding proper. The whole event could be completed in 30 to 45 minutes. The wedding breakfast was the reception equivalent of the era, but it was usually a breakfast in name only. In an era when the main meal of the day was dinner, eaten in the afternoon or early evening, the post-wedding meal was held immediately after the ceremony and was sometimes literally a breakfast in the morning sense, featuring cold meats, cakes, fruits, and wine. It was held at the bride's family home, attended by the same small group who had been at the church, and concluded in a few hours. The cake was a feature, often a fruit cake rich with currants, iced and decorated, but not the towering spectacle of later centuries. The formalities of the wedding did include some traditions still recognisable today. The giving of the bride by her father, the exchange of rings, the wedding vows, the signing of the register. Many elements of modern weddings can be traced directly to Georgian practice. What has changed is the scale and the theatricality. A Georgian wedding was a family event conducted with restraint, not a public spectacle. The idea that a wedding should be the largest party of the couple's life was a later development, driven by Victorian sentimentality, industrial prosperity, and eventually the massive marketing machinery of the 20th century. After the breakfast, the couple departed, sometimes for a short journey to the groom's home, sometimes to begin the bridal tour that would count as a honeymoon. The guests dispersed. The bride's family returned to the house, now emptier than it had been. Within a day, the bride was gone from her parents' household for good, having transferred legally, socially and physically to her husband's life. The wedding was quiet. The transition was not. The wedding night was, for most couples, a deeply awkward encounter between two people who barely knew each other and had likely never been allowed to be alone in a room together until that moment. Sex education consisted of, at best, a vague conversation with a mother or an aunt on the morning of the wedding, usually featuring the phrase, "lie back and think of something pleasant." Many young wives arrived at their wedding night genuinely unclear about what was supposed to happen. Many young husbands weren't much better informed. The information vacuum for young women was nearly total. Any discussion of reproduction, anatomy, or physical intimacy was considered indecent, and mothers who did try to prepare their daughters often did so in such veiled terms that the actual content was unclear. A bride might know in the abstract that something would happen on her wedding night, but the specifics were frequently a surprise. Some diaries of the period record young women arriving at their wedding night in a state of genuine bewilderment, not from innocence exactly, but from a complete absence of factual information. Imagine being handed the keys to a car you've never been told exists, and being expected to drive it. Young men fared only marginally better. Some had picked up information from older friends, servants, or trips to the continent. Others had visited brothels during their university years, an unspoken but common practice among the wealthy. A few had no experience at all, and were as nervous as their brides. The assumption that all young men were worldly and all young women were innocent was a cultural fiction. In reality, the range of experience on both sides was wide, unpredictable, and rarely discussed openly even between the spouses themselves. The physical setting added to the awkwardness. The wedding bed was typically in the groom's house, in a room the bride had often never seen before. Her belongings had been delivered earlier and her maid had unpacked them. She would undress with her maid's help, put on a nightgown that was likely part of her trousseau, and be left alone to wait for her husband. He, meanwhile, would be downstairs having a final drink with his friends or his father, gathering his nerve. The entire household knew exactly what was happening, and pretended not to. Servants outside the door could hear everything. There was no privacy even in the most private moment of the couple's life. The morning after was its own ritual. The bride was expected to appear at breakfast looking composed, and the household would observe her carefully for signs of her new status. In some traditions, the bedsheets were checked for evidence of the marriage's consummation, though this practice was less common in English aristocratic households than in some continental ones. Regardless, everyone knew what had happened or had not happened, and the social pressure to have performed correctly was enormous. A bride who appeared visibly shaken, or a groom who seemed embarrassed, generated gossip that could circulate for years. The consequences of a disastrous wedding night were hard to escape. In a society without divorce, a couple who found themselves physically or emotionally incompatible on their first night together had to figure out how to proceed for the rest of their lives. Some managed, developing a functional intimacy over time. Others settled into separate bedrooms and separate lives, meeting in public as needed, and otherwise maintaining parallel existences under the same roof. This was more common than Victorian sentimentality later acknowledged, and it worked, after a fashion, as long as both parties accepted the arrangement. The emotional truth of the Georgian wedding night, stripped of its myths, was that it was a moment of profound vulnerability for two people who had been given almost no preparation for it. Some couples emerged from it genuinely connected, others emerged from it permanently estranged. Most fell somewhere in between, muddling through the first weeks of marriage with a mixture of goodwill, confusion, and the slow discovery that the person they had married was a stranger they would now spend decades getting to know. After the wedding, wealthy couples often embarked on what was called a bridal tour, which was the ancestor of the modern honeymoon, except significantly less romantic and significantly more logistical. The couple would travel, often accompanied by family members or close friends, to visit relatives, see sights, and generally get to know each other in the relative privacy of a coach, trundling across muddy roads. It was less a romantic getaway and more an extended supervised playdate with inheritance implications. The companions were the most startling feature to modern eyes. A typical bridal tour was not a private trip for two. The bride might bring a younger sister or a cousin as a companion, which was considered suitable given that the bride had just left her family home and might appreciate feminine company. The groom might bring his own friend or brother, add a lady's maid, a valet, and various coachmen and postilions, and the newlywed couple was travelling in a mobile caravan of about 8 people. Privacy was found in whatever quiet corner of an inn the couple could negotiate, which was rarely. The itinerary tended toward the educational and the social rather than the romantic. Couples visited landscape gardens, stately homes, historic ruins, and natural scenic spots. The Lake District was a popular destination after the Romantic poets made it fashionable. The Peak District offered dramatic scenery. Bath, Brighton, and Tunbridge Wells provided fashionable urban amusements. The point was to see places, observe improvements to other people's estates that might inspire improvements to their own, and generally acquire experiences that could later be referenced in conversation. A bridal tour was part relaxation, part cultural curriculum, and part networking opportunity. Visiting relatives was a major component. The newly married couple was expected to call on the groom's extended family, the bride's extended family, and any family friends of significance. Each visit might last several days, during which the couple would be put up in a guest room, paraded at dinners, and introduced to everyone in the neighbourhood. This was the social equivalent of introducing them to the entire network, and it gave the relatives a chance to inspect the new spouse for the first time. For the couple, it meant almost no alone time, an endless sequence of formal dinners, and the obligation to be charming to strangers every evening. Travel itself was punishing. Carriage journeys were slow, bumpy, and frequently uncomfortable. Roads were poorly maintained, and mud could reduce a day's progress to a few miles. Inns varied from reasonably comfortable to genuinely appalling, with shared beds, questionable food, and insects in the mattresses. A bridal tour that lasted 6 weeks might include only a handful of genuinely pleasant nights amid a long sequence of jolting coaches and unfamiliar beds. The idea that this was romantic required a considerable act of imagination. Some couples did manage to carve out moments of genuine intimacy. Long coach journeys, despite their discomfort, could create hours of uninterrupted conversation, during which the newlyweds actually got to know each other. A shared walk through a ruined abbey, even with a cousin hovering at a polite distance, allowed quiet exchanges that could feel like small victories. Picnics, private dinners at quiet inns, and the occasional morning ride together gave glimpses of what a real relationship might look like once they returned home. Some bridal tours genuinely cemented affection, others simply tested it. The tour typically ended at the husband's principal residence, where the bride now began her real adult life. Her new home might be a London townhouse, a country estate, or a more modest establishment depending on his income. The staff had been informed of her arrival and had prepared the household for her. She would walk through the front door, often for the first time, and become the mistress of an establishment she had not chosen, surrounded by servants she had not hired, in a life that was now entirely hers to manage. The tour had been the transition. The home was the destination. The marriage proper was about to begin. Here's the thing, though. Despite all the arranged meetings, negotiated settlements, chaperoned dances, and pragmatic calculations, Georgian couples did sometimes fall genuinely in love. Real affection bloomed in letters, in stolen glances across dance floors, in long conversations about poetry and philosophy, in shared jokes whispered at tedious dinners. Love was not the organising principle of Georgian courtship, but it was not absent from it either. Many marriages, begun as financial arrangements, evolved into deep partnerships and lifelong devotion. The surviving letters between spouses tell a story that is warmer than the cold machinery of settlements might suggest. Couples separated by travel, military service, or family obligations wrote to each other with tenderness that feels entirely modern. A husband away on business might write daily to his wife, describing the small details of his days and asking for hers in return. A wife caring for a sick child might confide her worries, her exhaustion, and her hope that her husband would return soon. These letters are not performances. They are the real texture of genuine affection, maintained across the distances that a slow-moving century imposed on couples. Friendship within marriage was more common than the period's public performances suggested. In a society where women were supposedly subordinate and men supposedly authoritative, many marriages in practice operated as partnerships, with spouses consulting each other on decisions, sharing worries, and developing private languages of in-jokes and shared references. A husband who trusted his wife's judgment might consult her on business matters, despite the official convention that such things were beyond her understanding. A wife who relied on her husband's support might lean on him in ways that violated the period's ideals of feminine self-sufficiency. The real marriages inside the formal marriages were often richer than the formal versions allowed for. Intellectual partnership was a real possibility. Some Georgian marriages paired spouses who could actually talk to each other about ideas. Women read widely when given the opportunity, and a husband who took his wife's mind seriously found a conversational partner available whenever he wanted one. Letters between husbands and wives sometimes discussed politics, literature, science, and theology, with both parties contributing substantively. The convention that women were less capable of such discussion was widely repeated and frequently wrong. Couples who discovered each other's actual minds often discovered a deeper attachment than the rules of courtship had permitted them to imagine. Grief at a spouse's death was often profound. Widowers and widows wrote of their losses in terms that were not formulaic. Diaries record long periods of depression, difficulty functioning, and a persistent sense of absence that lasted for years. If Georgian marriages were merely business arrangements, as the cynical account sometimes suggests, the grief responses would be less intense. The grief was real. The attachment had been real. The commercial frame of the marriage had carried a genuine human relationship inside it. And when the relationship ended, the frame could not disguise what had been lost. Some marriages, of course, were miserable. A period that emphasized practical matching over emotional compatibility produced its share of couples who spent decades barely tolerating each other. Separate bedrooms, separate social circles, and the quiet rearrangement of daily life to avoid each other were familiar solutions. The Georgian era did not invent the unhappy marriage, but it did offer fewer exits from it. Divorce required an act of parliament and was practically available only to wealthy men with excellent lawyers. Most unhappy couples simply adjusted, yet the counterweight to the unhappy marriages was the surprising number of genuinely loving ones. Letters, memoirs, and family papers preserve the record of couples who had not expected to love each other, who had married for reasons that had little to do with feeling, and who had discovered across years of shared life that they genuinely preferred each other's company to anyone else's. The romance of Georgian life was not the flashy, passionate variety celebrated by modern popular culture. It was quieter, slower, and often arrived long after the wedding itself, but it arrived. And when it did, it was durable, because it had been built on daily life rather than on first impressions. The rituals of Georgian courtship may seem absurd to us now, but their echoes are everywhere. The diamond ring, the father giving away the bride, the white wedding, the bridal shower, the engagement announcement, the dance at the reception. These all have roots in the customs and anxieties of the 18th century. Even the modern concept of the dating season, where people ramp up their romantic efforts in certain months of the year, is a direct descendant of the London season. Georgian courtship was ridiculous, yes, but it built the scaffolding on which a surprising amount of modern romance still rests. The formal engagement period, for example, is a direct inheritance. The idea that a couple should have a defined interval between the decision to marry and the marriage itself, during which they announce their intentions to family and friends, exchange rings and plan a wedding, comes directly from the Georgian model. The specifics have softened, but the structure remains. A modern couple posting their engagement on social media is doing essentially what a Georgian couple did when their mothers wrote to every relative in the country to announce the news. The wedding ceremony itself preserves much of the Georgian template. The bride walks down an aisle given by her father to meet the groom at the altar. They exchange vows in front of a minister and witnesses. Rings are given. The couple is pronounced married. A reception follows. Changes have accumulated, of course, but the bones of the event are recognizable from 2 centuries ago. Even the detail of the wedding breakfast survives in many cultures, though it has shifted to afternoon or evening and grown into something considerably more elaborate. The concept of the honeymoon grew out of the Georgian bridal tour, though the specifics have transformed considerably. The idea that newlyweds should go somewhere alone together, away from their families, to begin their life as a couple, is a refinement of the Georgian practice. What the Georgians did with several companions and a coach, modern couples do with plane tickets and a hotel reservation. The underlying social function, a transition between the wedding and the resumption of ordinary life, has persisted. Even courtship itself, as a structured dating process with stages and expectations, owes something to the Georgian template. Modern dating advice still operates on roughly similar principles. Early encounters are cautious, interest is signalled gradually, commitment is announced publicly, and a wedding culminates the process. The timelines are faster, the chaperones are gone, and the dowries have vanished. But the basic shape of going from strangers to married partners still follows a path the Georgians would recognise. Swiping through profiles is not so different from scanning a crowded ballroom for potential partners. The filters have changed. The sorting is the same. What has genuinely transformed is the question of choice. Georgian women could technically refuse a proposal, but their real options were narrow, and the pressures to accept were enormous. Modern women can accept, refuse, postpone, negotiate, or opt out of marriage altogether, and still lead full lives. This single shift, the expansion of actual choice, has transformed the meaning of every ritual that surrounds it. A modern engagement that looks superficially like a Georgian one is in fact a completely different event, because both parties have entered it freely in a way that was rarely possible 2 centuries ago. And yet, for all the progress, some of the old anxieties remain. People still worry about marrying well. Families still have opinions about their children's choices. Financial considerations still quietly shape who partners with whom. Reputation still matters, even if it is now managed through social media rather than drawing rooms. The machinery has modernized, but the human concerns underneath have been remarkably stable. We inherited from the Georgians not just the rituals, but the worries, the calculations, and the hope that somehow, despite all the arithmetic, love might still find a way in. So the next time you sign up for a dating app, receive a wedding invitation, or watch someone get down on one knee, know that you are standing at the end of a very long line of people, going back through powdered wigs and ballrooms, all trying to solve the same ancient puzzle. How do 2 human beings find each other, choose each other, and agree, for whatever reasons, to spend their lives together? The Georgians did it ridiculously. We do it differently. The underlying attempt has not changed. And so, as the candles gutter low and the ballroom empties for the night, we leave behind the powdered wigs, the aching corsets, and the endless choreographed dance of Georgian courtship. What a spectacle it was. A world where love arrived wrapped in legal paperwork, where a glance across a crowded room could launch a marriage or destroy a reputation, where aunts with iron spines guarded drawing rooms like fortresses, and where a single misplaced sentence in a letter could echo across counties for years. Imagine it. Imagine being 17, laced into whalebone, pushed into a presentation dress that weighed more than you did, and told that the next few months would determine the entire shape of your life. Imagine writing letters you hoped no one else would ever read, knowing that half the household would read them anyway. Imagine dancing for 30 minutes straight in a room lit by 500 candles, with no deodorant in the entire building, while your mother watched from a chair by the wall, cataloguing every glance. Imagine being handed, at the altar, to a man you'd met perhaps a dozen times, and being expected to build an entire life with him before the week was out. And yet through all of it, through the absurdity and the unfairness and the genuine hardship, people found each other. They laughed at tedious dinners. They scribbled bad poetry in the margins of their diaries. They fell in love slowly, awkwardly, sometimes without ever quite meaning to, and they built lives together that lasted through illness, distance, loss, and the slow, quiet accumulation of years. The system was ridiculous. The humans inside it were not. So tonight, as you drift off in your warm bed, free to text whoever you like at 2 a.m, free to refuse a proposal without a lawsuit, free to marry for love or for companionship or for no reason at all, maybe spare a thought for the young women who once waited in silent drawing rooms for a suitor to arrive, for the nervous young men who rehearsed their proposals for weeks, for the aunts who embroidered by the fire and pretended not to listen, for the couples who survived their wedding nights with nothing but good manners and mutual confusion, and somehow, against all odds, came to love each other anyway. Because history may be strange and slow and deeply committed to ceremony, but it's also proof that people are hopeful, stubborn, and kind of ridiculous. They always have been, they always will be. Good night,